Hello and welcome. You are all here today for How to Accessibility if you're mostly back-end. We'll have our speaker up here, Hilary Stohs-Krause. So Hilary is a senior software engineer at Red Canary. She serves as a board member for several tech and community organizations. She loves board games and bourbon barrel-aged stouts and got way too into plants during the pandemic. So with that, please welcome Hilary to the stage.
All right, so we're going to talk about how to approach accessibility if you're mostly working on the back end of the tech stack. And really, it's just about how do we create these inclusive tech environments, not only for our users, but also for our colleagues. So that's a big focus of what we're going to talk about today. So a little bit about me. Like she said, I'm a senior software engineer at Red Canary. I have an adorable ragdoll cat. It's the same cat as Taylor Swift, if that means anything to people. And I'm the kind of nerd who dresses up when I go to the Renaissance Fair, so yeah. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? First, we're going to have a little bit of an introduction, talk about what do we mean by the word accessibility, because I think that's one of those words that can mean a lot of different things. And then we're going to get specific. So how do we approach this when we're looking at our code, and how do we approach this looking at kind of some of our general practices? So first, why do we even need to worry about accessibility? Right? Typically, we think about external users when we hear accessibility, and we think about the interface, the front end. There's also internal users. So a couple of stats here. 16% of people globally have some kind of disability. 20% of people have dyslexia. 8% of men are colorblind. And it's not just older people, right? I think sometimes we think, oh, as we get older, people have vision issues, they have mobility issues. 1 in 12 adults under 35 has a disability. So this means that there's a very strong chance this includes one or more of your coworkers. And they would benefit in ways both big and small from our products and our processes being more accessible. And the best part is, right, we hear this a lot, accessibility improvements benefit everyone. And here are some examples. So Alexa, who here has an Alexa or some kind of thing like that they talk to? A couple people? Okay, yeah. So the first full text-to-speech synthesizer was invented in 1976 to help the blind community. And now these are in so many people's homes. Audiobooks, who listens to audiobooks? Yeah, right? Same thing. First one was recorded by the American Foundation for the Blind in 1932. Who uses an electric toothbrush? That's the most hands. Yep. Good, everyone's got good dental hygiene, love to hear it. Those were invented in 1954 for people with limited motor skills. So again, these either have a neutral or positive impact for a lot of people, but they were initially invented for very specific communities who needed that extra boost. And it turns out we all could use an extra boost. And so even if these aren't things that you think, oh, this would really help me, or this would help someone I know, having these practices is becoming more and more something that is either commercially required because consumers are caring about it, or legally required. And the more we can do now versus waiting until we're forced to, the better it is for everyone. And it's just the right thing to do. So what do we mean by accessibility, right? We heard some of those stats about folks who have disabilities, but it really goes very far beyond that. What even is a disability, first of all? So this is from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. This is their definition of disability. A condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. So this is fairly open-ended. What are some of the states that we could consider to be needing accessibility? So long-term disabilities, right? These are kind of the ones I think we think of a lot when we hear the word accessibility, such as blindness, ADHD, paralysis. There's also temporary disabilities, right? So you broke your arm, you had long COVID, whiplash from a car accident. But there are also, again, those experiences or conditions that can make things more difficult that we need to think about when we're going through our daily lives. So think about coworkers who have a first language that's different than the rest of the team, who are early in their careers, who have a baby at home, right? You're getting less sleep, you have higher stress levels. You use a different tech stack in your current job than your previous job. All of these are conditions of the body or mind that make it more difficult to do certain activities. And we want everyone on our team to feel supported and included, right? And to minimize any struggles that they might have wherever possible. We make our products accessible, but not the processes by which they are built. Our development practices themselves are inaccessible. So this is an engineer at AWS who was born with, full vision, and over time has been losing more of their vision. So there are two main ways we can approach accessibility when we're thinking about the back end of the tech stack, right? The first is the code itself. The second is general practices. But first, if there is one thing that you take away from this talk, it is this. Avoid abbreviations. Avoid abbreviations, avoid acronyms. I'm going to repeat this a few times throughout the presentation, but I just really want to give this a call out. Abbreviations increase the need for context or interpretation, so by avoiding them, we're decreasing that. It helps to prevent confusion and misunderstanding, because a lot of abbreviations are used for multiple different concepts. This is something I actually heard at Red Canary. Can you bug TSC to connect with the CSM about AWS and CB? And I've been there long enough now, about 9 months, that I know exactly what this means. But when I first started, people would throw these out constantly, and I was scrambling while trying to listen to everything else they were saying to also interpret, okay, what does that mean again? Oh, right, that's this thing, which has this context, and that's why they're saying it. Okay, and then you end up missing half of the rest that's going on. So just don't do it. It's just not that helpful. So first, looking at the code, readability. We all know naming is the hardest thing to do in computer software, right? So let's make it a little better. One of the big things here is finding a balance between meaning and length, and I'm going to show some examples of what I mean by this. So we want to be able to convey our intention without, having 30 character variable names and method names, right? So just trying to strike that balance. The more verbose it is, the easier it is to understand, but the shorter, the easier it is to skim. Pronounceable words. This is a big one that I think about a lot that I didn't consider until I started researching for this talk. So writing code that we're able to say or read out loud. This is better for screen readers who are actually reading it out loud, but it's also helpful when we're pairing, right? If you're trying to read a line of code to be like, oh, is this the one I want? And you can't say it out loud, or it has no vowels and all consonants. So you stumble, it takes more time, it decreases that immediate recognition or comprehension. So let's take a look at some examples. So I know there's a lot of text up here. The key thing we care about is the variable names. So in the first one, our two primary variables that we're comparing against each other, we name them failed and old. Tells us something, but not very much, right? Other example, instead of failed, we have has reached max failure before finishing. Instead of old, we have has been running longer than acceptable. It's very clear, but that's a lot of typing, that's a lot of reading. This is actually harming as much as it's helping. And here's a good example, right? Reached max fails, and running too long. It's telling us the key details that we need for each of these conditions that we're checking, but it's not giving us more information than we need. So really finding, again, that balance between making it clear what you're capturing without writing a novel. Really like this, let the code be unambiguous and self-documenting. We're going to talk a little bit about documentation coming up as well. Using words for placeholders or iterations instead of letters. This is like my personal pet peeve in programming, and some of my PRs are literally just going through other people's loops and swapping out their placeholder for something that's more recognizable. So an example I think about that I see at Red Canary a lot is people will use S, the letter S, as shorthand for subdomain, which refers to one of our client, accounts. And there was a 500-line spec file that was all under one big loop because we were iterating through 4 different subdomains, and the iterator was an S. And I needed to adjust one spec at the bottom, and I just see S everywhere. And I have no idea what S means. And so then I have to go back up to the top, figure out where this is being set. It's just not worth it. Just write subdomain. It's so much better. Choosing existing method approaches that read like sentences. So this is especially true for a language like Ruby, right, which is meant to be sort of grammatically correct, to read kind of like you're writing sentences in English. And so here's an example of what I mean by that. This was the code that I found when I was working on an existing file. CB equals message.gsub, new line character, replace it with blank string. I can figure out what's going on here if I read it, right? This isn't super complicated code, but this is so much better, right? So this is carbon black equals message.delete, new line character. They're doing essentially the same thing, but one reads more like a sentence, one reads more like code. And whenever possible, we want to opt for the sentence structure versus the code structure. Linters. How many people use linters at their work? Oh, good. Okay, great. So I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, but linters are great for accessibility for a number of reasons. One, they make your code consistent, and more importantly, they make it predictable. Because the rules are written down, right? If you're wondering, why did someone, structure it this way, or I'm adding this new thing, how does RuboCop want me to do it? You can just go look it up ahead of time. And I think that's great. It takes away a lot of the guesswork. It takes away a lot of the sort of personalization that people might throw in. For example, at Red Canary, we love our linters. So we use RubyCop, Hamlint, ESLint, Catalint for Docker files. Linters are great. They're just fantastic. So what are some general tips for readability? Line length. This is a big one. So RuboCop's default limit, I think, is 100 characters, and there's a reason for that. Studies show that we read best, we comprehend the best, read the fastest between 75 and 100 characters. And so I always think about the New York Times website, which is meant literally for you to read large chunks of content. Their average line length, they don't go above I think it's 100. I think they stick generally around 79 characters is the average for their line length. And there's reasons for that. That's just how we read better. Additionally, more but shorter lines of code are better for screen readers, generally speaking. When people use screen readers, they have a lot of customizations they can do and set them up differently, but generally speaking, it's better for screen readers. Of course, the best, again, like we heard earlier, is writing code that reads as close as possible to an actual sentence. More shorter lines of code is also helpful for people with dyslexia, or if you're having concentration issues, or if you're just really tired that day, right? All of these things play into how well you're able to do your job and understand what you're looking at. Indentation, this is another big one. Again, it's all about balance. Trying to balance between what your linter wants, which sometimes looks really funky, and you're doing all these weird things just to get the linter to not yell at you, versus what's actually readable for human people. And you might be thinking, okay, well, you're talking a lot about screen readers and how do we make things work for screen readers, but how many programmers actually use screen readers? According to Stack Overflow's 2023 survey of developers, almost 1 in 50 are blind or have vision issues. And I think the thing we have to remember is that blindness is a spectrum, right? So there are some people who can see, maybe in front but not on the side, some people who can just see a pinhole, some people who can see really close but not far away, right? There's all these different conditions that can fall under the concept of blindness. And a lot of people also lose their visual acuity over time. So one of my coworkers is older, and we were pairing, and I noticed he had, magnified 4 or 5 times on his screen when he was screen sharing. And I thought, oh, are you checking to see that it works on magnification for users? And he's like, no, this is how I use it. I'm old. His words. So just something to think about, right, is there's a lot of reasons why people might do better work or have fewer struggles with some of these changes. So here's an example of indentation. So the actual content here isn't important, just seeing how much white space there is until we get to that list of arguments. And that's okay, right? RuboCop accepts this, it thinks it's fine. But I would argue that this is better. So we've just moved it in under that first argument that we're passing to input. And you might be thinking to yourself, I just hate how that looks, right? And that's fine. It's okay to have a preference. The issue is that preferences are personal, but accessibility is global. And again, it comes down to the idea of predictability, of following these consistent patterns. And I always think about, like, I know a lot of us work from home now, but if you had to go into the office still, or if you like to go into the office, and at your desk was the most uncomfortable chair, like it was hard, and maybe it had little spikes in it for texture, and there were no armrests, and it was just the worst chair. But you had to use it because your office manager thought they looked cool. That's kind of like this, right? So just something to think about. The way that we do this might be someone else's really awful office chair. And it's easy enough to just change it and give them something that's more comfortable. Couple hot takes on readability. Comments are amazing and broadly underutilized. So there's this old truism, right, that good code doesn't need comments. And actually at Red Canary, there was a principal engineer who said something like this in one of our Slack channels. He just threw it out there. He's like, okay, I know that this might be controversial, but I don't think we should use comments. I think we should just write better code. About 2 or 3 weeks later, I gave this talk at an internal gathering at the company. And then a couple weeks ago, I saw that he was requesting code comments on someone else's PR. And it was like, look how far we've come. Just felt really great. Really, my take on this is like, yes, we want to have clean code, but comments are also awesome. Like, why not use both, right? It helps to provide context. It helps with memory. So when we think about, oh yeah, it's obvious why we're making this decision right now. Clearly, we couldn't do it this way. Well, you might not remember that in 6 months, right? Or someone else coming on who doesn't have that context is definitely not going to know why we didn't do it this way. Maybe change it to the more obvious way. No one's going to catch it in code review, and then we end up with problems. And so there's just really very few reasons not to have comments as long as you're also writing good code. Who here works on an API or has it at some point? Okay, awesome. So we're going to talk a little bit about APIs. So again, naming, this is a big one. One of the key things is using consistent descriptive fields. And so if you refer to something as, like cat collection, one place, later if you're nesting in a different call, don't refer to it as like cat group. Just keeping it very consistent. Making your endpoints guessable is like the best thing we can do. Using word separators. So this one I thought was interesting. I didn't know about this till, again, I started looking into this talk. Using underscores instead of just mashing it together, right? Not only for screen readers, but also it's just easier for us looking at this to read, right? Active underscore file underscore type. They're actual words instead of active filetep, which is actually how my brain tries to read that. These also aren't just for screen readers, right? This is just for people in general. So maybe your primary language isn't the language your API is written in, or maybe you haven't worked with an API before. You're not as technical as somebody else, or maybe this is the first time working with your API. These just benefit everyone and make our products easier to use. Again, abbreviations, right? One thing you take away, abbreviations, no bueno. Write out the words external service instead of ext service. Previous instead of prev. This is, again, screen readers, and also if this isn't your first language, you don't necessarily know at a glance, like, what does prev mean? Or prev, as it looks. Documentation. So this is another big one, and we've got a whole section on documentation coming up, but specifically related to APIs, if you're using a generator to show your different endpoints and what the calls are and the methods, try to pick one that meets those accessibility criteria. So this is the one that we use, which unfortunately does not. You can see full color vision example and a colorblind example. It's very hard to tell which ones are gets and which ones are posts because the colors look the same. Again, more on that in a bit. The specs, writing tests. So there are things we can do as well to make sure that our tests are accessible. First, just having tests, I would argue, is an accessibility issue. So the more specs that we have, right, the better documentation we have through this area. And that's helpful, again, for people who are newer to programming, people who are newer to your tech stack, people who are newer to the language, the programming language that you're using, people who are stressed out, people who are on call and waking up at 2 a.m. and trying to figure out what's going on with this one service that keeps hitting errors. Same rules, again, apply about naming, avoiding abbreviations, being descriptive, all of that. And I really like to think about writing my tests to tell a story. So some of the ways that I do that are going in a narrative order. Like, okay, first, what is the best thing that could happen here? Great, let's show that that works. And then we want to also test the negative assumptions, right? Like, what happens if you pass in nil? What happens if you pass in the wrong data type? What if you don't pass anything in? What if I don't have internet access? What if, I do it in the wrong order? All of those things are really helpful to show, not only just, I find it's a lot in specs if people will say, okay, here are all the things that it does. And I'm like, great. Can it do this? I don't know. It doesn't say that it can't. Maybe someone just forgot to write a test for this, or maybe this is newer functionality. But when I see tests that are like, here's everything it can do, here's everything it can't do, I feel much more confident making changes to that code. And that's something that's really important. You can also use tests to actually check for accessibility measures in the UI. And so that, again, is kind of moving more towards the front end part, but it's a way that we can have this sort of holistic view about how we're approaching accessibility in our code. So a couple hot takes. Wet tests are the new dry. I've also seen damp, which was descriptive and meaningful presentation? Not presentation. But basically saying that, yes, we don't want to repeat ourselves, right? We want to have clean code. We want to be efficient, but only to a certain extent, right? We can go too far in the name of being dry. And I want to shout out to Amanda Boehner for introducing me to this idea. She wrote a blog post about why wet tests, should be used more often. And this is a quote from that blog post. She says, if our test suite takes too long for a newcomer to understand, it's a strain on velocity. If our team members don't feel confident updating it, it's a product liability. And I think this is really true. And so it's not just that we have enough tests, it's that we have tests written in a way that people can understand, they can see what's going on, they're not looking at line 495 and being like, what is S? That's a throwback to the subdomain, just in case anyone, yeah. And then documentation. So we talked about tests as a form of documentation. There's also written, more traditional documentation. And there are so many ways that we can approach this in a way that increases how accessible they are to a wide variety of people. One thing that I didn't put on a slide here, but that I like to just give a call out to is we could write the best documentation. We've got all of our, alt tags, it's in semantic order, it's, no abbreviations, and then no one updates it for a year and a half. And then it's suddenly not very good documentation anymore, right? So one of the ways that I work to prevent this is we use Confluence for our documentation, and you can get a link that's just everything you've touched. And so I have a repeating monthly calendar event. I think I make it an hour on a Friday, and I just go through that list. And I'm like, okay, do I know anything more about this now that I've been here longer? Do I know anything that's changed here? Is there new documentation that I could link to in the resources area of this old documentation to give people, more places to go to learn more? And it doesn't take that long. Mostly I spend 15 minutes on it, but it's just a great way to keep it at the forefront and make sure that we're not letting our documentation get out of date. So how do we make it good in the first place? Some traditional considerations: don't use images of text or code samples or terminal output, which people might be laughing, but I have come across this multiple times, and I go to highlight it and it just drags the entire image, and it's so frustrating. Just use the actual text. It takes 2 extra seconds. Just do it. It's so much better. I know someone was like, well, I really like how the color highlighting is here, or that gives additional context, that's important. And I'm like, great. Put the screenshot, and then underneath, put the actual code. And that way you get both. This is just an easy thing to do that can make a big difference. Making sure your color choices have high enough contrast, right? We talked about people who are colorblind, people who have vision issues. I've noticed this. I tend to use our Confluence in dark mode, but someone else uses it in light mode. And so now I've learned to just toggle between the two quick if I'm adding any colors, and just be like, okay, can I still read this? Great. Using semantic HTML. So this is achievable, right? No matter where we're doing our documentation, if we're doing it in Google Docs, if we're doing it in Confluence, if we're doing it in some kind of wiki, just following those orders, right? Starting with your H1s, working your way down, using paragraphs and list tags, and it really makes a big difference, not just for screen readers, but also for skimming, right? The more subheads we have, the more I can see, okay, where am I trying to get to in here? This is the part that I need. It also helps if you have a, using software that does auto-generated tables of contents. It's going to pull directly from your semantic HTML. And including captions and transcripts for video documentation. This is an area that we are just starting to try and improve on. This can be more work, but we figured out after some trial and error that we can play the video on our laptop, run a Zoom with just us, have the Zoom do transcript, and actually it works pretty well. So we just need to go back through our backlog and do that for all those videos. And this is also we talked about how accessibility isn't just for people who have, federally recognized disabilities. People learn in different ways. So some people love to watch videos. Some people like to read the transcript. Some people want to read the transcript while watching the video. And so the more options we give people for being able to absorb content and to learn, the better it is for everyone. Keeping it simple. So this is, again, something I learned a lot about when I was researching for this talk. One thing to think about before I go into kind of how we do this is sort of the why. So again, that Stack Overflow survey from 2023 that I mentioned, more than 10% of programmers said they have a concentration or memory disorder. That's a lot of people. And again, if you're on call in the middle of the night and something goes wrong, your ability to consume large blocks of text is severely diminished. And when it's hard to concentrate or rely on information that you already know, or recall information you already know, you're extra relying on what's written down for you to follow as a guide, right? And one of the best ways we can do that is by keeping our documentation simple and easy to interact with. It helps a variety of people. So people with cognitive considerations, we just heard. People, again, whose primary language isn't the same. Those who are unfamiliar with the concepts you're communicating. And I think about this one a lot. It's very easy for us to overlook how much we know about something. And so when I write documentation, I really try to think okay, this is an intern reading this who has never worked on this before, doesn't know what's going on, is starting from scratch. And that's where, again, having those subheads with the semantic HTML really helps. Because people might say, oh, well, if you're over-explaining, then that's just a lot more words for somebody else to read, right? Not if they can skip it. So if I have a section that, what is sidekick? How do I find our sidekick? And those are headers, they can just see, oh, I know that. Oh, okay, here we go. This is what I actually want. How do I restart the queue? How do I do whatever? So a lot of these pieces of the puzzle really fit together in ways that, again, make it better for everyone. People who are stressed or multitasking have limited attention spans. How many people have been trying to do multiple things at once in the course of the workday? Yeah, some people aren't raising their hands, but you have. So how do we keep it simple? Avoiding ampersands. This was an interesting one. I think it was screen readers that are bad with ampersands, but also because it's a symbol that we really don't see that often, it stops your brain when you hit an ampersand. And so honestly, just writing out the word "and" makes it easier to read. Keep sentences short. So we talked about this a little bit with our code, right? Our line length. Sentences, they found that when the average sentence length is 14 words, readers understand more than 90% of what they're reading, which is great, right? We want people to be able to understand what we're writing, otherwise there's no point in writing it down. If we go on the other end of that spectrum to 43 words, so fairly long sentence, maybe a couple of semicolons, different clauses, comprehension drops to less than 10%. So I know I'm annoyed when I read a sentence and I'm like, what? What did that just say? And you have to go back to the beginning and read it again. That's just really annoying, right? So by keeping our sentences shorter, we're making it a lot easier for people to consume the content. And then test the reading level of your text. So this is one that I never did until I learned that it was really helpful for folks. And there's a couple of options in English. I was looking for some in other languages, but haven't found any specific ones yet. I'm sure they exist. But Hemingway and plainlanguage.gov are a couple if you're writing documentation in English that will literally tell you like how complex is what you've written. So here's an example. So this is some documentation that I put into Hemingway. And so it analyzes it and it says, okay, here's what's good. Here are some phrases that you could write more simply, right? They have simpler alternatives. Here are some sentences that are really hard to read. You'll notice that a couple of the, well, maybe you can't see, but a couple of the red sentences here that is highlighted are where I have a link to another piece of documentation or a link to a, Splunk query or Sentry query. And links are something where, and I think I actually talk about this in a little bit, but writing out URLs are generally hard to read. Sometimes it's useful if you want to give extra context, like, oh, this is, you can see through the query what we're looking for and tell if that's the one you want or not. But I think it's better to just do that with actual words. And putting click here, see here, visit here, all of that is challenging for screen readers because they are just reading that text. And also for just someone, again, looking for something in a hurry. So making the text of our links what the actual link is going to is really helpful for people. So it was right to call me out on that, and I went back and I changed it. Some other tips and tricks for documentation. So like I just said, link text should be informative, not click here. And this one I really have to stop and think about when I'm writing documentation because it's so ingrained in me to just be like, see more here, and then put the link in. But I really try to think like, okay, what are they going to? And I know I've had instances where I click on a see more here and it doesn't go where I think it is. And that's super frustrating, right? Like, oh, this is going to take me to, using the Sidekick example, like take me to Sidekick's documentation. And it said it's just like sidekick.com. And I'm like, that's not helpful. I wouldn't have clicked on it if I knew that's where you were taking me. So really it's letting people make informed choices about what they're going to click and not click from your documentation. Writing dates and times in unambiguous ways. So this is one that comes up. May 10th, 5:10 or 10:05. And it's just different depending on where you live and what the cultural norms are. And so I think about that, like we have some people on my team who are not from the States and who might write it differently. And I see all the time we have the slash notation for writing dates. And it's like, just write out May 10th. That way there's no confusion, everyone knows. And then again, if you're trying to read this in a hurry, you're not trying to parse these numbers and figure out what it is. You can just see May 10th. Great, understood. Avoiding using socially charged terms. So this is something that I think a lot of the industry's been moving towards anyway, but it's always good to think about when we're writing our documentation as well. And so this list is specifically like American English socially charged. I can't speak for other, countries or cultures, but some examples: allow list versus whitelist, or main versus master, core feature versus native feature. So things to think about when we're writing our documentation is, are we writing this in a way that is accessible and inclusive and not going to potentially give a reaction other than the one that we're intending? And a lot of the documentation guidelines we just kind of went through apply for general communication as well, but there are a couple things that I wanted to highlight. So being deliberate, really thinking about when we're communicating, like what are we trying to say, what are we trying to convey, and how do we do that in a way that everyone can not only understand, but again, we're not giving those sort of unintended consequences. So being careful of assuming cultural context. Not everyone celebrates certain holidays. Not everyone grew up watching a certain TV show. And when people talk about something in a way that they expect you to know what they're saying and you don't, that can just feel alienating or confusing. And especially if you're newer to a team, or again, your first language is not what everybody else's first language is, you don't always feel comfortable being like, wait, why are you referencing that? Like, how is that relevant? And sometimes it is relevant, right? Sometimes they'll say like, oh yeah, it's like when this happened in that TV show. And it's like, oh yeah, totally, okay, we know how to fix it. And you're like, I don't though. Like, how did they fix it? I think this is especially an easy trap to fall into when most of the people on your team do have a similar cultural context. Watching for gender assumptions or exclusion. So we had a situation at my company, and this was totally not intentional, but it doesn't change what the impact was. We'd done a round of hiring, and someone was like, oh, we have even more Kevins, at the company now. Like, I should update that old names list. And so they had a chart, and it had derivatives of common names, and then a bar for how many people at the company had that name. So like, Andre and Andrew, things like that. There were 26 different names. All were men's names. And it's a small thing, but they literally erased all the women. Like, no one looked into how many Sarahs do we have? How many Jessicas do we have? How many Marys do we have? Like, very common names. And we called this out, and they immediately, changed it, fixed it, added in names for, women, non-binary people, whatever, like not just male names. But it was such a simple thing to avoid, and someone just didn't realize that they were doing it. And so again, no one did this on purpose. This wasn't the end of the world, but it did kind of suck. And so just thinking about when we're doing that, making sure that we aren't being exclusionary even with small things, because all those small things, as a lot of people know, all those small things just kind of add up over time. Speaking of small things, adding your pronouns and your name pronunciation to your profile is super helpful. Even if you think someone doesn't need it, even if you think, oh, I have a super common name. So, well, maybe you have a common name where you live, but someone on your team might not be familiar with that name or how to pronounce it. And I have a coworker, and he has a Chinese name, and I heard like 4 different pronunciations for it in my first couple of weeks, and started questioning, like, am I saying it wrong? Like, how do you say it? And then I went and checked his profile, and he actually had his pronunciation in his profile. And so not only putting yours there, but also checking your coworkers just to make sure that you're pronouncing theirs the way that they want and you're using their pronouns. Avoiding phrases like "it should be easy." Maybe for you, maybe for most people. But again, 1 in 10 programmers have a memory or concentration disorder. Maybe you're running on little sleep. Maybe you're dealing with some mental health issues. Maybe this is just a part of the code base that you have never touched before. And so instead of saying it should be easy, I like to try and say, like, I think it'll be straightforward. Or I think that, you should be able to follow I think this story is accurately estimated. Something like that. And always throwing in but if you run into trouble, let me know. Or if something is confusing, we can go through it together. Just making sure that we're creating this environment where people feel like they can ask questions and there aren't assumptions about their abilities. I think that's really the big thing. So then moving kind of away from sort of us as individual developers and looking at like what are engineering policies that can create an inclusive and accessible environment for our coworkers. And so we're looking beyond the obvious ones here, like having a wheelchair accessible entrance or gender neutral paid family leave, and looking really like what can engineering specifically do to make our workplaces more accessible. Flexible work schedules, right? This is a big one, so it doesn't matter, giving people the space to follow whatever schedule works best for their family or for their sleep patterns or transportation issues, all of that. Choosing vendors and tools that prioritize accessibility. So there aren't always times, we talked about API documentation. There aren't always times that we can make direct changes to an interface that we're using internally or externally to make it more accessible, but we can pick tools that already are accessible or are committed to moving towards accessibility. So making that a part of our criteria when selecting tools can go a long way. Giving education and training on how to support colleagues with disabilities. So when I gave this talk internally, I had multiple people come up to me who said, oh, I have ADHD and like the documentation you stuff said will be so helpful for me, but I didn't want to ask anyone because I didn't want to be a bother. And it's like, we want cultures where people are happy to bring up accommodations that would make their jobs easier, right? Especially when it's these small things that any of us individually can contribute to. So making this something that is regularly talked about and not something where the onus is on the person who would benefit from these changes to bring up, but we're all thinking about it collectively without needing like a use case in mind. So kind of being proactive about it. And then offering people a variety of tools to get the same kind of task completed. And this is important because tools like Canines can make using Kubernetes more accessible for individuals with dyslexia or color blindness than using kubectl. Allowing developers to customize their setup to their preferences is a crucial aspect of enhancing accessibility. So again, making sure that people have access to tools that they're able to use. Because if we make everyone use the same one, and even a couple people on the team either can't use it or can't use it very well, that's hurting everybody. So this talk was about the backend, but even if we're primarily working as backend engineers, most of us have to interact with the front end at some point in the course of our work. And so if our UIs aren't accessible, engineers probably are still going to struggle with them to a certain extent. So largely out of scope for our discussion here, but I want to just take one quick example. So again, 8% of men are colorblind. 83.6% of the top million most visited websites have color contrast issues. So that's a lot of just struggle that doesn't need, like a layer of struggle that just doesn't need to be there for a lot of people. And this is just one example, right? And it's not just folks with disabilities. So I think another key accessibility requirement for websites is being able to navigate via keyboard. And I know many Vim users who would love if they could just navigate everything by keyboard, right? So enabling people to use tools and software in different ways just gives everyone more choice to work in the way that's best for them, which means that the whole team, the company, everyone is doing better and more successful. So a couple of takeaways. Most of the work for accessibility, especially on the back end, even on the front end, but especially in the back end, is these small individual efforts over time. It really is this collective movement that helps everybody. Changes to make our products or processes more accessible, easier to use, benefits everyone. And really that's the key here, right? Is we're making things easier to use. And I don't know why we wouldn't want that. I love when things are easy to use. And even if you're rarely touching the UI, the user interface, the front-end code, there's still a lot of things that you can do to have an impact on accessibility, not just for external users, but especially for your colleagues and your coworkers. And a lot of disabilities are invisible, right? And so, and especially if we're working remotely. So one of my coworkers has hearing aids. And I had no idea because you can't tell on Zoom. And then when we met in person for the first time, I was like, oh, I didn't even know that that was a thing. And so I think it's much safer to assume that some of our colleagues do have disabilities and to just work with that as our sort of underlying assumption than to default to the assumption that they don't until they tell you. Because also some people just aren't comfortable bringing this up, right? Like with the coworker I have with ADHD, like he was like, oh, I didn't want to be a bother. I didn't, no one even knows. That's just a real shame. So let's just assume everyone has some kind of condition or experience where building in these accessibility changes will benefit them. And then it's just good for everybody. And then avoid abbreviations and acronyms, please. Again, one thing you do, just write it out. This is one of the 4 core values at Red Canary where I work, be kind and authentic. And I think about this a lot in terms of doing accessibility work, right? Striving for accessible working environments, it's just the right thing to do for our colleagues. So even if we ignore the fact that when everyone else's job is easier, your job is easier. And when the product is better, I don't know, theoretically you make more money, right? If we throw all of that aside, it's just the right thing to do. And so I really encourage everyone to try and pick at least a couple of these and think about how you can incorporate them into the work that you're doing to make your workplace and your individual, contributions more accessible. And that's everything I have. And then some citations. And then my email in case anybody has any questions about anything. I'm also, if we have time, do we have time? No time? Okay, come find me afterwards. I love talking about this. Also, I have some socks if anyone's into socks for swag. So, thank you.